A few days ago, John Hopkins released what was essentially a raw data packet and a minor interpretation of that data with the caveat that they would need to look into this much further to be able to go along with this idea that they were presenting. Now, because this was about COVID, and it didn't stick to the very strict and very precise narrative that has been built up around this disease, obviously within a day or two, poof, it was gone. So I'm going to have a link to the archive of it so that anyone that doesn't believe what I'm about to say can feel free to read through it as I have. The long and the short of the data and the hypothesis that was put forth by the person was that essentially what we're seeing is we're not seeing an increase of the number of total deaths, at least in the US, which for as built up as COVID has been, we should be. What we're seeing is effectively a transference of deaths. Uh, People that, for example, would be dying of heart disease, the still by a wide margin #1 killer in the US, are instead dying of COVID. So it's actually causing a drop in the number of heart disease deaths this year, which is something that I can absolutely believe because for the portrayal that COVID has, that it is the second coming of the bubonic plague, for as deadly and as contagious as it has been portrayed as, it should be causing a massive spike in the number of deaths, again, in the US. But it's not. It's a thing that I've noted for a very long time that it can't even keep up with Spanish flu numbers. So this thing is, first of all, before anyone misinterprets what I'm saying, it is contagious, it is deadly. I'm not arguing that point. I am arguing the portrayal of it. For as deadly and contagious as it has been portrayed as by the media, and particularly by the left more than any other group, this thing should have a death counter that easily surpasses heart disease, that would actually see a significant measure in our deaths. For reference, the bubonic plague was so devastating that it actually caused a drop in the global population scale. For the There were a few instances where, while the global population, if you actually looked at it on a chart, had a very small curve upwards, the bubonic plague and I believe World War I and II are basically the only times in Earth's history where it actually saw a noticeable dip and then started going back up again. For as bad as COVID has been portrayed as, we should be seeing, not that because we have so many fucking people that that's basically never going to happen again, but at least in the US, we should be seeing something of note. But we're not. And this kind of goes along with explaining why that is. Now, they once again emphasize they need to look into this further because this is just a hypothesis. So I say, yeah, go ahead. Like, that actually sounds like a decent hypothesis for this. I do say look into it further. But again, because it didn't go with the narrative, it got out of existence. And the reason that John Hopkins took it down, I'm going to quote them so that, again, I don't get... it's not said that I'm taking things out of context or misinterpreting things. The article was being used to support false and dangerous inaccuracies about the impact of the pandemic. No, it was showing that it's not as deadly as the narrative would have you believe it is. On a mass scale, on an individual scale, yes, this thing will either really fuck you up for a while or straight up kill you. We're not arguing that. No one is arguing that. What they're arguing is the overall impact that it's having, and it's not having anywhere near as significant an impact as we were led to believe. And people could argue lockdowns and restrictions and social distancing and masks and etc. have made it so that it's not having that kind of impact. The fact that it is still spreading far and fast today, that it's spreading further and faster today than it has at any point in the US. The fact that New York still leads in total number of deaths for any state by about 50% of its next closest state, and they were one of the strongest and strictest lockdowns to have happened. That tells me that it's not to do with any of that, but it is to do with it is not as bad as has been portrayed. And that's the weird thing that I just don't get, is that this idea that just looking at raw data is somehow bad. This has been a thing with the left for a long while. The biggest example that I can use, and if I wasn't unsearchable before, I will be after mentioning this, is 1350. Now, you may have heard of that number or some minor variation of it on the internet before. What it is, the FBI did a breakdown of crime statistics. Black people, while accounting for 13% of the population, commit 50% of the murders. I am not making any sort of interpretation. I am not taking any stance. I am not saying any sort of opinion related to that. Just saying that is effectively verboten amongst the left, because just saying that without anything else is racist to the left. That you are being discriminatory against black people for pointing out a statistic that was brought forth by the FBI. Unless you say all cops are bastards, the cops framed black people, etc., something of that. Just saying that data point is racism. It's a data point. It holds no opinion. It takes a personal interpretation at the very best to be seen as racism. I do not believe that unless you're going, oh hey, look, black people account for 50% of the murders, we should murder the blackies. No, fuck off. If you think that, screw you. That is when, yeah, you're racist. Otherwise, if you're just looking at that and trying to extrapolate why that may be or what could have caused that, that's not racism. That's just looking at a fucking data point. That's the biggest example that I can bring up. There have been many other examples throughout the last 5 years, at the very least, where just any data point that doesn't go along with a prescribed narrative for a situation is seen as racist, sexist, improper, discriminatory of some kind, you name it. The left will come up with it. Hell, COVID itself, if you said that it was bad or that COVID was dangerous initially, was seen as racism by the left. People seem to forget that COVID is political because the left is the one that made it political. When people were initially like, hey, this COVID thing might be a problem, the left in many countries, including the US, were screaming racism so bad that they actually had I'm not kidding, feel free to look this one up if you don't remember it, Hug a Chinaman Day. That's what they called it. It's amazing that we take these people seriously, and yet here we are. Raw data does not hold any sort of political opinion. It is just raw data. The interpretation that comes from it is what can be seen as political. And this was the most milquetoast interpretation of this data I have ever seen. To put in perspective what this person was saying, because it's just so basic that it should be seen as, yeah, that seems like the base level for how you would look at this. Say you legalized assisted suicides. You're going to see a increase in suicide deaths and a decrease in deaths from some of the biggest, worst diseases where you still live a few years with the disease. I would think leukemia would be a good example. You're going to see a drop in the number of leukemia deaths, but an increase in the number of suicide deaths, because there's effectively a death transference. Now, this isn't a one-to-one comparison. It's the general idea that's being put forth, which, once more, the author emphasizes needs to be looked into more, because this is just at the hypothesis level. There's nothing controversial being said here. There's nothing to, once again, quote John Hopkins themselves after destroying their own article, that supports a false and dangerous inaccuracy. There's nothing being put forth and nothing repeated by anyone that isn't just, hey, maybe we should look into this more, because this does seem to kind of go in line with observable fact. That seems to be the major issue these days, is that data is, there are some forms of data that are just absolutely verboten, there's my word of the day, that to the left, if they do not go along with the exact idea that the left is presenting, if they contradict in any way a long-held belief, or a newly held belief even, of the left, that point of data is effectively a sin and must be purged from all existence. They aren't open to the idea of, we may be wrong in our interpretation, and so that's why we need to look into this and reevaluate. Hell, that's why you hear the left continuously go, we've always said that COVID is bad, when they were the ones that shouted first that COVID is literally nothing. That's how we've ended up in this situation to begin with. Once they realized, oh shit, COVID is actually bad, they not only flipped, they went hard the other direction and said that this is the second coming of death itself. In no small part because they could use the lockdowns to control people, but that's another story entirely. I just view data as data. I'm a math guy. I look at statistics, numbers for fun and giggles. I just see this as information. How you interpret it is up to you. Just existing should not be a criminal offense for this. And yet that seems to be where we're headed with anything that doesn't go along with a prescribed narrative or a prescribed idea. And that is terrifying. When you are so adamant in your belief that it is exactly this way, that you have deemed any data and any information that contradicts it is to be purged from all existence. First of all, you are not the resistance. But secondly, you are the dictator you ascribe your opponent to be. Because that is absolutely what happened in dictatorships. Hello, Stalin, my old friend. This has been Math Machine saying, numbers aren't racist, people are racist. Learn the difference. Peace out.